Orgies, mysterious holy relics, dog-headed monsters, riches of dead kings. Today I'm blowing the lid open on some of the Vatican's most forbidden pieces of history. The fallen angels and the origin of evil. The Vatican might just be safeguarding the secret history of humanity. The Book of Watchers is a banned biblical book outlawed by the Vatican that tells the potentially true story of how the angels fell from heaven. The book was written about 250 years before the birth of Christ. It's a sort of expansion pack for the book of Genesis, going into specific details about why the world was flooded. Spoiler alert, it was angels teaching sins to humans. The book claims that the angel Asael descended from heaven and taught forbidden knowledge to women about makeup and jewelry. The angel explained how they could facilitate lust in the hearts of men by using cosmetics. The same angel then taught men how to make swords and daggers and beautiful bracelets of gold. With the weapons of war and the seeds of jealousy planted and lust burning in their hearts, the world was changed. This passage from the book says it best. And there was great impiety and much fornication, and they went astray, and all their ways became corrupt. This wasn't the only sin the angels taught to men. Azael and his other devious angels taught humans magic and gave them forbidden knowledge. Men and women learned how to charm and cast spells and to make medicine from nature. This was hardly the end of the damage wrought by the angels. Chief among them was the angel Shemihaza. It was his idea to start mating with human women. This is even mentioned in the book of Genesis, in the official Old Testament. But the Book of Watchers gives more specific details. Here's another passage from the book. Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. The angel Shemihaza convinced the other angels to breed with human women, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim. The Nephilim then decimated the planet, destroying humans, eating one another as giant cannibals, and drinking pure blood. Things got so bad that God sent the flood to get rid of them. Yet even with the Nephilim dead, their spirits lingered. They couldn't go to heaven, and there was no place for them in hell. It's believed that to this day, the souls of the Nephilim haunt humanity, always trying to force people to sin. The Book of Watchers was seen as too sensational even for the church. Could there be people at the Vatican who know the world was overrun by evil angels and giant cannibals? Orgies in the Vatican. The House of Borgia installed themselves as popes during the Italian Renaissance. Nepotism ran rampant, to the point the Vatican was hosting bizarre orgies, and that's only the start of the insanity hidden within the Vatican. The House of Borgia grew immensely in power during the 15th century. They were a noble family with their heritage going back to the days of the Kingdom of Aragon, which dominated parts of Spain, Sicily, France, Malta, Italy, and Sardinia. Even though they only installed two popes, Pope Calixtus III and Pope Alexander IV, their family was everywhere. They infiltrated the church like termites infiltrate a rotting house. The first pope in the Borgia family was Alphonse de Borgia, born in 1378 into the Kingdom of Valencia. To be honest, he wasn't even that terrible compared to some other popes. He worked as a law professor at the University of Leda before he became a cardinal. He was made Pope Calixtus III in 1455. He was so old that he died 3 years later. During those 3 years, he did a handful of notable good things. For example, he cleared Joan of Arc of any wrongdoing. Remember, Joan of Arc had been burned alive on May 30th, 1431, at the young age of 19 for heresy. It wasn't a good look for the church. Pope Calixtus also installed his nephews as cardinals. He made sure that his family was embedded in the church before he died. The next Borgia pope was Rodrigo Borgia, Alphonse de Borgia's nephew. He was scandalous even before becoming pope. He had fathered several children with a variety of women, but in 1492 he was elected pope anyway. He chose the name Pope Alexander VI. The first thing Alexander did was crack open the Vatican vault. He started spending money and throwing parties like he was the King of France. He also engaged in rampant simony, meaning he sold positions in the church. You could buy the title of cardinal if you had enough money. It wasn't about who was holy, it was about who had the deepest pockets. But what about the orgies? I know that's the whole reason you're still watching. One of the most scandalous moments during Alexander's papacy was a dinner party on October 31st, 1501. It's known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The party took place at the Papal Palace in Rome. The guests were mostly ladies of the evening. There were about 50 prostitutes, which Vatican officials called courtesans, invited to entertain Alexander and his pals. I think you can figure out what the entertainment was without me getting graphic. Alexander's reign of lewdness came to an end 2 years later when he caught malaria and died. It was a rather unremarkable end for one of history's most debaucherous popes. And now for number 8. But first, it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Jorge Gonzalez Laramendi for your generous super thanks. Subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. The Pope gives away the True Cross. Apparently, the Vatican has enough pieces of the True Cross to give them away as presents. When Britain's King Charles III recently walked into Westminster Abbey for his coronation, he did so behind a processional cross containing the most important relic in Christianity. 2 fragments of the True Cross were embedded in the center of the processional cross. The fragments were given to the king as a gift by Pope Francis. But why? And how? And there are just too many questions. According to a Vatican official, the 2 fragments given to King Charles came from a relic preserved inside the Vatican museums. However, there wasn't much more information given. The Vatican basically said, "Trust us, bro, the fragments of the True Cross came from our museum and it's legit." But can you really trust what the Vatican says? As you'll learn throughout today's video, you definitely can't. The True Cross was the real cross that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on. It was the very one that Christ carried up the hill where he was to die a mortal death. According to the legends, it was Helena who recovered the True Cross at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Helena was the mother of Emperor Constantine the Great. He was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity in the 4th century AD. The True Cross was already 300 years old. Helena didn't just find Christ's cross. She also uncovered the 2 crosses of the thieves who were executed beside him. However, nobody knows where those 2 crosses are today. These days, almost every major church in the world claims to possess relics of the True Cross. The Roman Catholic Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, and even the East Syriac Church. They all claim to have shards of the original cross. Yet the Vatican seems to be the only organization handing them out to kings like Halloween candy. Are these really pieces of Christ's cross, or is the Vatican giving away random pieces of old wood? In 2016, scientists with Oxford University studied a fragment of the True Cross kept in Ireland's Waterford Cathedral. They dated it to the 12th century, proving scientifically that the wooden fragment is only about 900 years old. This doesn't necessarily mean the Vatican is lying about having pieces of the True Cross. They might truly believe that their artifacts are real, even though radiocarbon dating says otherwise. Here's a crazy bit of information you might not know. In 2022, a piece of the True Cross supposedly sank to the bottom of the ocean during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Archpriest Sergei Kaliuta claimed the True Cross relic had been brought onto the Russian missile cruiser Moskva. Then it sank, taking the relic with it. Number 7. The false bones of the apostles. Jesus Christ may have ascended to heaven, leaving no physical trace of himself behind. But what about his apostles? Where are the skeletons of the 12 disciples of Jesus today? And what does the Vatican know about it? 2 of them are in Rome, safeguarded inside the Santi Apostoli Church. In English, it's called the Church of the 12 Holy Apostles. It was first commissioned to be built in the mid-4th century AD under the order of Pope Julius I. Before the church was even finished, the decaying remains of St. Philip and St. James the Younger were brought to be taken care of by the monks. The thing about the apostles is that nobody cared much about them in the 1st century after Christ's death. Being a Christian for the first several decades was a brutal nightmare. It wasn't until the 4th century that Christianity became accepted as the official religion in Rome and its states. It was around that time when churches appeared across the continent, like the Santi Apostoli. It was also around this time that church officials started trying to recover the bodies of the disciples and other Christian martyrs. The first known movement of a martyr's body was in 354 AD. The skeleton of St. Babylas was transferred from a cemetery in Antioch to the city of Daphne. He was then placed in a church that was built especially for him by Roman governor Caesar Gallus. This was what really got the ball rolling. After the first martyr was removed from his grave, it became very popular. Within a year, St. Andrew, St. Lucas, and St. Timotheus had all been dug out of the ground and moved to Constantinople. Nobody knows who managed to track down the bones of St. Philip and St. James, but they appeared in Rome in the 6th century and have been there ever since. Only a few fragments remain, a bit of a tibia, a femur, and a mummified foot. The tibia and foot belong to Philip, while the femur belongs to James. But how do they know for sure that these are the remains of actual apostles? They could just be random human bones, right? The Vatican might be bluffing. Well, modern science can help. Professor of Chemistry Carl Lund Rasmussen from the University of Southern Denmark was allowed to radiocarbon date the bones. Carr and a team of experts failed to date the tibia and foot because they were too contaminated. But they did get an approximate age for the femur that belonged supposedly to St. James. I have a bit of bad news for the believers out there. The femur turned out to be from somebody who died around 214 AD, which means there's no way it belonged to St. James. This person lived 160 years after St. James was already dead. Who the bone really belonged to is a mystery. Professor Carr said that even if the femur doesn't belong to James, it was likely taken from a Christian grave. Whoever brought it to the Sancti Apostoli Church likely believed that it really did come from James's leg. But as far as science is concerned, all evidence points to the Church celebrating the bones of some random people, not Jesus' disciples. It makes you wonder what other holy relics aren't even real in the Vatican and other churches in Rome. The Pope assassinated Lincoln. One of the weirdest episodes in church history was during the American Civil War, when the Pope supported the losing side. More than 150 years ago, Pope Pius IX sided with the Confederate Army. It was sort of like how the Pope sided with Hitler during World War II, though this is all very hush-hush, so I wouldn't bring it up at the Vatican if I were you. Pope Pius IX sat upon the throne of the Vatican starting on June 16, 1846. This was when the Church was still at the peak of its power. Rather than only ruling the Vatican and a few hundred people, Pope Pius IX ruled the Papal States, a massive area with more than 3 million people in it. The point is that he was a very powerful man, a supreme monarch even. The mid-1800s was also a time when Italians were moving to America in massive numbers, bringing their trust of the Vatican to the US. The Vatican spoke out against things like freedom of speech, freedom of worship, self-government, and other American ideals. The Vatican was still pro-monarchy and pro-aristocracy. They were also very anti-Protestant. The Vatican viewed the large number of Protestant Americans as a huge problem. Then came the US Civil War and the Austro-Sardinian War. The war in Europe saw the Pope lose the Papal States. This was a major blow to the Church, with Pope Pius left with a small chunk of Italy. The rest, his previous empire of over 3 million, was gone. One of the first nations to recognize the new Kingdom of Italy was the United States under Abraham Lincoln. The Pope did not like it. What the Pope did like was the letter sent to him by Jefferson Davis, leader of the Confederacy in 1863. Jefferson Davis thanked the Pope for his prayers of peace. When the Pope wrote back, he addressed Davis as the illustrious and honorable Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. The Pope had made a big statement by doing this, officially endorsing Jefferson and the Confederacy as the rightful government in America. Vatican diplomats tried to backpedal, but the damage had been done. The United States was outraged. To make things weirder, the Pope sent Davis a signed photograph of himself after the war when Davis was in prison. Like, hey, sorry you're in jail, here's a signed picture of His Holiness to make you feel better. There's even a rumor the Pope sent Davis a crown of thorns, though this has never been confirmed. As for the assassination, the Pope obviously didn't pull the trigger, but he may have incidentally encouraged the hit on Abraham Lincoln. In the wake of the president's tragic death, it was discovered that a large number of the conspirators were Catholics. It's believed they were inspired to kill the president because of the Pope's apparent support of the Confederacy. On February 28, 1867, the United States Congress passed a law banning any future funding for diplomatic missions to the Vatican. The law remained in effect until the 1980s. That's how mad the US was at the Pope. King Solomon's treasure. King Solomon is remembered as a powerful, wise king whose story became larger than life. King Solomon is venerated in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam for his wisdom and is said to have been the wealthiest man on earth. But this legendary ruler is one of the Bible's greatest unsolved mysteries. In the Hebrew Bible, Solomon is described as a powerful king ruling over a vast kingdom, and Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. He received thousands of pounds of gold a year, and his kingdom prospered thanks to international trade. All of this prosperity allowed him to build some of the most monumental building projects, like a magnificent palace and the first temple in Jerusalem. This monument served as the permanent home for God and the Ark of the Covenant. The temple was so impressive and so holy that once the Ark was placed inside the temple, Solomon celebrated by sacrificing 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. Then a magnificent party and feast lasting 14 days. So, what's the issue? Why do we not take this ancient section of the Bible as fact? Because there are no written records of King Solomon at all, not in Egypt or Syria. Any inscriptions from the First Temple period are extremely rare. So let's focus on his wealth. King Solomon is believed to be the wealthiest person to ever live on Earth. He had an estimated net worth of $2.1 trillion as of 2021. He had gold mines that would give him about 25 tons of gold annually, and a fleet of trading ships that would bring back gold, silver, ivory, and baboons. British marine archaeologist Dr. Sean Kingsley has found evidence that Solomon was not only a real king, but also the world's first shipping magnate who funded voyages carried out by his Phoenician allies. For over 10 years, Kingsley has been searching from the Holy Land to Spain to Sardinia, looking for archaeological evidence supporting biblical accounts of Solomon's partnership with Phoenician King Hiram. In port towns and mining hills, there are mentions of Solomon's name, and there are even accounts that people were sent by Solomon to collect the gold and silver. Kingsley, who has explored more than 350 shipwrecks in the past 30 years, found that it seems like Solomon paid the Phoenician sailors to bring him the goods from all over the Mediterranean. Another research team led by Mark Kavanagh has another interesting take on Solomon's wealth. They say that perhaps King Solomon didn't get rich from all the gold mines, but from copper mines in the Negev desert. Around the 10th century BC, when King Solomon ruled, the Negev desert had become one of the most profitable copper industries on the planet. It's possible that these mines also belonged to King Solomon. Could it be true? Was Solomon the world's first shipping magnate and merchant emperor supreme? Could some of his gold be hidden in the Vatican? Saint Christopher and the Jackal God. What if some of the Vatican's most favorite saints weren't even real? And what if these fake saints are copies of ancient Egyptian gods? Why does Saint Christopher have the head of a jackal? This guy looks just like the jackal god Anubis, lord of the Egyptian underworld, protector of dead bodies, lord of the pure land. Anubis wielded power over the desert and necropolis. He ordered his jackal servants to watch over the dead from the darkness. Here's a cool statue of Anubis, created in the Ptolemaic period between 332 and 30 BC. The images from the Met. Now here's an image of St. Stephen hanging out with St. Christopher, the painting from the 17th century by an unknown artist. St. Stephen is the human one. St. Christopher is the one that looks shockingly like Anubis. According to legend, St. Christopher was originally from the land of Canaan. He was born with the name Ophiro and was a servant to a king. One day he abandoned his king and set off on a journey, hoping to find a better master to serve. On a stormy night during his quest, Ophiro carried a child on his back from one side of a raging river to the other. When he got to the other side, the child revealed himself to be none other than Jesus Christ. From that moment on, Ophiro was known as Christ-bearer, which is where the name Christopher comes from. It's a weird story that gained a lot of popularity during the Middle Ages. Then the story fell out of favor, vanishing almost completely by the 17th century. It was only in the modern age, with motor travel and airplanes, that St. Christopher became popular again as the patron saint of travelers. None of this has answered the question of why he has a jackal head. In ancient artwork going back centuries, St. Christopher is almost always depicted as a very large man with a child on his shoulder and his staff in one hand. Oh yes, and the head of a dog. Historians have never been able to figure it out. One guess is that St. Christopher's dog head is the result of a misinterpretation of Latin. Somebody may have confused the Latin word Cananeus, which means Canaanite, with the Latin word Cananeus, which means canine. Another guess is that St. Christopher was a member of the dog-headed race that once lived in Europe. Wait, What? Forget about werewolves and vampires. During the days of the Roman Empire, people believed in a race of beings who had the bodies of humans and the heads of dogs. They were called cynocephalus. People believed they were real well into the Middle Ages. The third theory is that St. Christopher is a rip-off of Anubis. He looks really similar to Anubis in ancient Egyptian artwork. Could there be some connection here that the church refuses to acknowledge? What do you think? The incorrupt nun. Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster died in 2019 at the age of 95. When she was exhumed in May of 2023 at the monastery she founded in Missouri, church officials were shocked by what they saw. Wilhelmina spent 4 years in the ground, but didn't decay at all. She is, according to Christians around the globe, a modern example of the miracle of God. This was huge news in 2013, so you may have heard about it. Thousands of people made the pilgrimage to the Benedictines of Mary, Queen of the Apostles Monastery in the town of Goa, all to catch a single glimpse of the nun's incorruptible body. But why was she exhumed? Why didn't her body decay? And is this proof of God's power? There are millions who believe Wilhelmina is evidence that everything the Bible says is real. She was buried at nearly 100 years old inside a cracked wooden coffin. She wasn't embalmed, so there were no chemicals inside of her to keep her from decaying. And yet, when she was exhumed in order to have her remains moved to the monastery chapel, Wilhelmina's body was in perfect condition, and so were her clothes that she had been buried in, which also should have started to decay. What's even crazier is that there was a mask of mold over her remains. It was so moist and soggy inside her cracked coffin that mold was able to grow on her skin. It was the perfect environment for a person to rot, yet the nun remained perfectly incorrupt. It's a scientific anomaly, and to be totally honest, it should be impossible. Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster is now recognized as the first African-American woman ever found to be incorrupt in the US. She's not yet being considered for sainthood pending a thorough investigation by Vatican officials, but it could happen in the coming years. What might be stopping the Vatican from admitting Sister Lancaster's body is incorruptible? While much of the world is convinced of the miracle, some scientists are doubtful. Nicholas Pasalacqua, a forensic anthropologist, told news outlets that it can often take 5 years for the human body to become skeletonized. Nicholas said that personally he didn't find it surprising that the remains were preserved after 4 years. Do you think it's a miracle or just a weird coincidence? Let me know in the comments. The mafia, the bank, and the bad banker. The Vatican is full to its brim with corruption. One of the most corrupt people in church history died in 2006 at the age of 84. It's believed he committed murder, embezzled money from the church, and was involved in the mafia. I bet you didn't know the Vatican and the Italian mafia are like two peas in a pod. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus spent the final years of his life in peace and extravagance. He played golf at a rich Arizona retirement home. He never spoke much about the crazy 1980s in which he allegedly drove the Vatican Bank into a collapse. He never talked much about his association with Michelle Sindona either, a man who died in prison after drinking a coffee laced with cyanide. Paul was at the head of the Institute for Religious Works between 1971 and 1989. You wouldn't think it by the name, but the Institute was the Vatican Bank, the entity that controlled all the Vatican's money. It was basically the Pope's bank account. You can bet it had deep, deep pockets. The bank did more than just keep the Pope's spending money safe. The Vatican Bank managed all the financial investments and overseas funds of the Roman Catholic Church and those who belonged to the church. In the 1970s and 80s, the bank also owned around 1.5% of Banco Ambrosiano, one of the largest private investment houses in Europe. The chairman of Banco Ambrosiano was Roberto Calvi. He and Paul Marcinkus were good friends, members of the top echelon of the Roman elite. Then something weird happened. Even though the Vatican only owned a small share, it somehow lost $1.3 billion worth of the investment house's money. It just sort of vanished. Only it hadn't vanished. The money had been loaned to almost a dozen offshore companies that were controlled by the Vatican Bank and Paul Marcinkus. In 1982, Roberto Calvi was discovered hanging underneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. It would be more than 20 years before 5 people were put on trial in Rome connected to his murder. And still, the case is unsolved. During the investigation into Calvi's murder, Paul hid himself in the Vatican like a child hiding under his blanket. He declined to answer any questions questions about the church's role in the creation of the fake companies that had gobbled up the $1.3 billion. This wasn't his first scandal. In the 1970s, Paul was involved with a Sicilian financier named Michele Sindona, who had connections with the real Italian mob. In 1974, Sindona's empire crashed, and the Vatican lost tens of millions of dollars. It was the Vatican that took the financial hit, and Sindona found himself jailed for life. Although it wasn't just for losing the Vatican's money. Sindona was charged with arranging the assassination of his own lawyer. 4 days after he was sentenced, he swallowed a fatal cup of poisoned coffee. Paul was also indicted in 1982 in relation to the lawyer's assassination and the crash of Sindona's financial empire. But shortly after the poisoned coffee, Paul was let off the hook. What you might not know is that Vatican employees are literally above the law. An Italian court ruled that Paul could not be prosecuted due to his status in the Vatican. Even the US wanted Paul in connection to $14.5 million worth of counterfeit bonds, but he was untouchable. King David, fact or fiction? King David is one of the most famous kings in history. In the Bible, David is described as the ideal king, a man after God's heart who reigned for 40 years. Over the centuries, he reached mythical status like King Arthur. Historians have often said the Bible exaggerated his actual historical significance. So, how much is fact and how much is legend? A web of ancient cities mentioned in the Bible show that King David was a major ruler. Historians mostly agree that David was a real figure who ruled a kingdom around 1000 BC, but they can't agree on how big that kingdom was. Now, Professor Joseph Garfinkel of the Institute of Archaeology at Hebrew University thinks he has an answer. The professor may have just proven the Bible to be historically accurate, at least when it comes to King David. Professor Garfinkel has linked 5 ancient cities in the region of Judea that were founded about 3,000 years ago. Each city was excavated individually as their own separate digs, so no one had ever connected the dots before. Now Garfinkel is using the cities as potential proof that King David ruled a mighty empire. The network of fortified cities around Jerusalem has been dated to the time of King David, more than 200 years earlier than previously thought. The argument is that the cities were all from the same time, connected by roads and ruled by King David. However, as you know, when it comes to King David and most things from ancient texts, there are 2 major schools of thought. One is that David was a Bedouin leader who ruled over no more than a couple thousand shepherds near Jerusalem. The other school of thought is that David ruled a humongous empire that included fortified cities near Jerusalem. The Bible says King David was the latter. He ruled a great and powerful nation according to biblical texts. The issue has always been that there isn't a lot of evidence. If he really was that famous, why isn't he mentioned more often in ancient texts and tablets and memorialized in statues like other rulers from the ancient world? Speaking of which, very few discoveries have created as much excitement as the Tel Dan stele. It is an inscription on a broken fragment of a stone slab dating back to the 9th century BC. The inscription found in Tel Dan, Israel, is written in Aramaic and describes the victory of an Aramaean king over the king of Israel and the king of the House of David. This is one of the earliest known references to the biblical figure of David outside of the Bible, but it still doesn't prove he existed or that he ruled a large kingdom. Could the Vatican know the Bible's depiction of King David is wrong? Are they lying to everyone? The debate rages on as to how powerful King David may have been, but these recent archaeological discoveries are exciting as they bring ancient stories and texts to life. What do you think the Vatican is lying about? Let me know in the comments, and thanks a lot for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and come back soon for more awesome videos.